cutie, I'm back. And today we have another episode of Beauty and the Bibliophile, Halloween edition. If you're new here, welcome to my channel and welcome to the Cute Life. I'm your cult leader, Leah. If you're not new here, thank you. Welcome back to another cult meeting. On Wednesdays, I try to do a series called Beauty and the Bibliophile, where I do my makeup and I tell you about the latest book that I've read. If you don't know what a bibliophile is, it is a lover and collector of books. Right here. Today's book is Fairest of All, and it is the first book in the Villains series by Serena Valentino. And this came out in 2009. Now, I did like this book, but I did think it was going to correspond with the Twisted Tale series, but it doesn't. Which I get it, like the Twisted series is like, you know, a what if scenario. Like this story, but what if this twist happened, right? So I think this is more the official backstory of the evil queen, I think. Now, just so you know ahead of time, there are spoilers. I obviously don't go over everything in the book. There is a lot that I have to leave out for the sake of time, but there will be some spoilers and you will know how it ends. So if you don't want spoilers, if you're gonna read this book and you want to know nothing about it, don't watch this video. If you are curious about this book, but maybe you don't want to take the time to read it, but you kind of want to know what it's about for the most part, or if you just want, you know, to try to figure out if you want to read the book, then this would be a good video for you to watch. Also, I am going to assume that you've seen the movie Snow White. If you haven't, I would suggest that you go watch that first before watching this video or reading this book. Otherwise, some things may not make sense. So, if you want to hear a summary of Fairest of All, the backstory of the evil queen, and watch me do my makeup at the same time. Look, I got my evil queen nails going on. Stay tuned. Okay, so Fairest of All, book 1 of the Villains series. So the book opens with a bunch of wedding guests showing up at a royal wedding. And everyone is very excited because they've all heard that the new queen is very beautiful and they all want to get a look at her. And she's also the daughter of a renowned mirror maker. Now this new soon-to-be queen was very happy because she was marrying a man she truly did love and becoming a mother to his daughter, who she also very much truly loved, and she was becoming the queen of these lands now. Now in this book, they never say her name, they just refer to her as the queen. Now in the Mirror Mirror Twisted Tale, which was about the evil queen, they give her a name. Her name is Ingrid. So I guess in this book they're just gonna call her the queen. So that's what I'll be referring to her as, the queen. Now as the queen was getting ready for the ceremony, her lady in waiting came in with her soon-to-be little daughter, Snow White, who was, I think, supposed to be around 4 or 5. And the queen gives Snow White a hug. And Snow's super happy too because this woman who she does like is about to marry her father and she's gonna get a new mother. And so the queen is hugging little Snow White and she's feeling like this tug at her heart, like love, like something she'd never actually really experienced before, this kind of love of a child. And this little child in particular was very lovely, very sweet. And there was a part of the queen that kind of felt like if she could hug her just tight enough, maybe she could absorb some of that loveliness and beauty, and then her herself would be truly beautiful. Now, the new queen had met the king outside of her father's mirror shop. Her father had gained a reputation of being an expert craftsmanship, and even the king was interested in buying his mirrors. Now, when the king showed up at his shop and saw the queen, the soon-to-be queen, and his previous wife is passed by this time, and he told the soon-to-be queen that she was very beautiful and the finest of all her father's creations. Now, the queen was very insecure, and when he told her this, we'll find out why she's insecure. But at this time, she's already developed some extreme insecurities, and she thought that the king telling her this was like a way of him teasing her, but he was actually being genuine. Okay, I'm gonna let my skincare set in for a few minutes before we move on to makeup. Now, her father was a very unkind man because he blamed her for her mother's death at her birth, okay? So he was always telling her that she was ugly and that, you know, she'd never live up to her mother's beauty, who was supposedly this, you know, super gorgeous woman. Her father had overheard the king tell her that she was beautiful. And later he said to her that, you know, she must be some kind of a witch or something who enchanted him into thinking that she was beautiful. But a few days later, after he told her this, he died. Ha! So then the king begins to visit her regularly, and he's always commenting on how beautiful she is. But the queen thinks that he's just flattering her because he wants something. Maybe it's her father's estate, or maybe his mirrors. But after a while, it seemed that he truly did only want her. Now, back at the wedding ceremony, the whole kingdom had shown up, including a bunch of the king's relatives, including his 3 cousins who were triplets, and they were very odd. They dressed very oddly, kind of shabby, I don't know what the right word is, but almost witchy, and they spoke strange. They would finish each other's sentences or sometimes even speak in unison. So anyway, then they get married. The queen is in bliss. She loves this man. She loves his daughter as her own, and she's just extremely happy. And so that night they go back to their chambers, and the king gives her his wedding gift, and it is a beautiful mirror. Now, the queen didn't know why, but this made her a little uneasy. But she was polite, and she thanked him very much for the gift. Now, a few nights later at dinner, the king gave the queen a box, and inside of it was a bunch of writings from his first wife. And the box had a heart with a sword through it. His first wife, Rose, she had started kind of documenting her life when she found out that she was dying, as a way that perhaps Snow could know her a little bit. And the king asked the queen if he would share them with Snow once she thought that Snow was old enough. I think he thought this was a way for them to bond. Now that night, the queen put Snow to bed. And while she was tucking her in, Snow asked her if she would tell her a story about dragons. She seemed to have a thing for dragons. She liked them. So the queen said, once upon a time, there was a very sad and lonely and misunderstood woman. And the woman enchanted a beautiful princess for the princess's own safety. And Snow says, well, why was she sad, Mama? And the queen says, I think it was because nobody loved her. And Snow White was like, well, why? And she said, because she didn't love herself. She feared rejection because she wasn't like anybody else that she knew. She was so full of fear that she sequestered herself away from the outside world. And her only companion and link to the outside world was a blackbird that would soar in the skies and gather information for her, which is how she found out about the little princess's christening that she wasn't invited to. Now, nobody knows why exactly, but she was very upset that she was not invited to this christening. But she also knew something that the princess's parents and her fairy godmothers didn't. Now, obviously, this is a reference to Maleficent and the Sleeping Beauty story, and I'm assuming we'll find out what this thing she knew that the others didn't know in the Maleficent book of this series, which we will do at another time. And Snow White was like, I thought you were gonna tell me a story about dragons, Mama. And the queen says, oh, I am, because this woman, she could turn into a dragon. And when she did, she was extremely frightening, fierce creature. But she said, we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. And then the queen noticed that Snow White had fallen asleep. Now, when the queen got back to her chambers, the king was there and he had some bad news. The kingdom was at war and the king would not send his men into battle alone. Now, obviously, this made the queen very upset, but she tried to stay strong and put on a brave face for him. But she was also thinking, oh, wait a minute, I thought he was in love with me. Maybe he doesn't love me as much as I thought he did if he would choose duty over love. I mean, if it was true love, wouldn't it be the other way around? Wouldn't he stay with her despite everything? I mean, he was the king. If he wanted to stay, he could. Everybody would understand. I mean, you can't have the ruler of the kingdom putting their life in jeopardy. Now, one night after this, he was gone. She was looking into the mirror that he had gotten her. And she thought, she swore, she saw something or someone move behind her in the mirror. She looked around, but she was alone. And she always kept her door locked, so she knew nobody had snuck in. But still, she was pretty sure she saw a face behind her shoulder in the mirror. So she took another look around just to be sure. But she found no one, so maybe it was just a trick of the light. But just to be sure, she glanced into the mirror one last time, and then she heard a voice say, "Good evening, my queen." The queen was so startled, she couldn't even scream, but she instinctively swatted at the mirror and it fell off the wall and broke. But when she looked down into the shards for a split second, she was pretty sure she saw a face looking back at her. So her servants came and cleaned it up and took everything away, but she could not get that image of the face out of her head. Now, a few days later, the king returned from battle. And as they were welcoming him back, there was a sudden explosion that just rocked the whole castle. And then smoke filled the room and the attendants all went scattering, looking for a place to take cover. The queen couldn't see anything because of all the smoke. She just started shouting for Snow. Then she felt somebody grab her arm, and it was the king. And he had Snow in his arms, who was bawling hysterically. So a bunch of men were attacking the castle, but the soldiers that had just returned with the king were able to hold them off. So the king took the queen and Snow White down into the dungeon. And he feels around on the ground and he finds a trap door and he opens it. And there's a staircase leading down the trap door. And he tells the queen to take Snow to go down the trap door, and there would be a boat on their moat, and to row it out of the castle. It would take them out of the castle and they would be safe. And then he runs off to join the battle. So the queen and Snow got into the boat and the queen rowed them out of the castle and into the swamplands that surrounded the castle. And the queen rowed them into a densely covered area, had a bunch of swamp grass and trees that they could hide in. And they sat there and they watched the skies light up orange and red all around the castle. Now, after the battle was over, the men were able to fight off the invaders. The king came and he found the queen and Snow White and he took them back to the castle. And the castle had held up pretty well, actually, though there was a bit of a mess. Now, the king and queen put Snow to bed, and after they did, they went back to their chambers. And when they walked inside, the queen saw something far more frightening than anything that had happened to them that night. And it was the mirror that she had broken, fully repaired and back on the wall. Now, the king told her that he had had it repaired, and he hadn't had a chance to tell her yet, but that was actually one of her father's mirrors that he had given her as a gift. And while the queen was kind of terrified and uneasy at this idea of her father's mirror hanging in her chambers, she was again polite and she said thank you. That was very thoughtful. Now the king had some bad news for the queen. He was going to have to go back into battle. He had to make sure that the invading kingdom that almost toppled their castle that night were driven back. And he would rather fight them in their kingdom rather at home where they could harm his family. And of course, the queen was very upset and she ends up just telling him everything, that when he's gone, she feels like she's losing her mind. And she told him about the man's face in the mirror that she saw. But the king just, kind of brushed it off and he chalked it up to her being tired or stressed from the fact that he was at war. So he told her, just get some rest, it'll go away. Now, after the king left, the queen thought about just having the mirror removed, getting rid of it, but it was a gift from him and everybody knew it. So if she got rid of it, what would that look like? It would seem kind of like she was rebuking his gift. So she couldn't just get rid of it. Now one day, the king's 3 strange triplet cousins showed up at the palace unannounced. And this kind of irritated the queen. How do you just show up for a visit, which in those days would have been a lengthy visit, without letting her know ahead of time? But the queen knew that the king valued family above everything else, and he had made it clear that his kin were always welcome at their palace. Now the 3 cousins' names were Lucinda, Ruby, and Martha. Now after they were taken to their room and they were settled in, they had tea with Snow. The queen was still getting ready, so she hadn't shown up for tea yet. And the cousins asked Snow, so how do you like your new stepmom? And Snow said that she liked her very much. And the sisters were like, oh, really? She's not ever cruel to you. She doesn't ever lock you away. And Snow was like, no, why would she do that? And they're like, so she's not the stepmother of fairy tales? And Snow's like, no, not at all. And the sisters are kind of like, well, we had hoped for some sort of intrigue going on here, but I guess we're just gonna have to make some of our own. And then they start laughing wickedly. And Snow's laughing too, but out of nervousness, uncomfortableness. Now later that day, the queen got word that the king would be returning in a fortnight. And of course, the queen was ecstatic, and so she decided she was going to make a celebration out of it. And she invited the triplets to stay for the celebration. Now, a fortnight is 2 weeks, so they were going to be staying at least another 2 weeks. So after he returned and after this great celebration, they go to bed for the night, and the king takes Snow to bed to tuck her in, and the queen goes back to their chambers. And she hears a voice say, "Good evening, my queen." And she looks up into the mirror, and there is a disembodied head floating in the mirror, and it looks like some kind of grotesque mask with hollow eyes and a long drooping mouth. And she says, "Who are you?" And it says back, "Don't you recognize me? Has it been so long that you don't recognize me, my daughter?" Now the queen screams, and the king comes running, and the queen's crying, and he's just like, what's wrong? And she breaks down and she tells him everything about her childhood, about how cruel her father was to her, and how having this mirror that was made by him might be driving her a little mad. And the king deeply apologized. He had no idea about how mean her father had been to her. And so he immediately goes over to the mirror, takes it off the wall and smashes it. Now, a month later, the king had to leave for battle again. And a few weeks after that, a very large package arrived for the queen. And it just had a note that said, "For your hospitality." But nobody seemed to know who it came from. So she opened it, and there it was, looking back at her. The face, the slave in the mirror. And the queen screams, and she's like, "What do you want?" And he's like, "I'm here to help you." And she says, "Well, how could you possibly help me?" And he tells her, he's like, "I can see all things in this land. And I know that you've been worried about your husband. And I can see him up until, as recently as a few days ago, and tell you how he is." And then he goes on to describe this battle scene and the king being impaled. And the queen starts screaming and yelling and crying, and she throws a glass at the mirror and it shatters. And she's like, "No, you are lying." And just then her attendant comes into the room, and she sees the queen all upset and crying, and she goes, "Oh, so you've gotten the terrible news already." The attendant's all upset and crying. And then the attendant says, "His body's on its way home now." So this validated what the mirror had told her. He wasn't lying. And the queen thought, "Oh my God, I am just going to absolutely die from this emotional pain." But she still had to tell Snow. So she goes to Snow and she tells her. And of course, Snow starts crying uncontrollably. And the queen is still so distraught with her own grief that emotionally she just cannot handle Snow. And she asks one of her ladies in waiting to take Snow and comfort her somewhere else. And Snow starts crying even more, and she's like, "No, Mama, don't leave me, I'm scared." And the queen becomes very steely and cold, and she just has the attendant take Snow away, and she goes to her chambers, and she just collapses on the bed. And this whole time, the mirror is watching her. Now, at the funeral, the triplets were there, And they come up to her and they're like, oh, did you get the gift that we sent you? And the queen is so kind of out of it that, you know, she's at her husband's funeral, you know, she's not all together. And she kind of just nods yes and says that, yeah, thank you. And one of the triplet sisters says that, you know, he can be a little, you know, brutish, that father of yours. So if you need any help taming him, just let us know. Now, after the funeral, the queen locked herself in her chamber for weeks. And she actually kind of wanted to see the face in the mirror, because apparently, obviously, he knew everything. And she wanted him to tell her about her husband in the afterlife. She wanted to make sure that, you know, he was in a good, safe place. And so she would go to the mirror every day to try to talk to him, but he wouldn't appear. Now one day, she's looking in the mirror, she's trying to figure out how to get the slave in the mirror to appear. And so she's just looking at her own face, and her eyes are all swollen, and her cheeks are puffy from, you know, weeks of crying and being depressed. And she's looking at herself and she's thinking, oh God, how could I have ever thought that I looked beautiful? Look at me, I look like a monster. How could I have ever thought that, you know, maybe I was beautiful because the king told me I was? How could I have ever possibly rivaled the beauty of his first wife, or my own mother, who was supposedly super gorgeous, or even little Snow White? And then right then, her father, the slave in the mirror, appears. And he says, it's been some time, my daughter. And she says, you know, I need something from you. I need you to tell me about my husband in the afterlife. Is he okay? Is he in a good place? And the face in the mirror says, he laughs and he says, no, I can only see things in these lands. I can't see beyond this life. And then he disappears. So a few days later, the queen sends for the cousins. She knows, or she suspects, that they'll be able to help her, since they had mentioned something at the funeral about that. Now, when they showed up at her chambers, the queen was like, you know, at the funeral, you mentioned my mirror. And they were like, oh yes. They're like, we made that mirror. We are the ones who actually bartered with the maker of mirrors for his soul. We took his soul and we trapped it in the mirror. They told the queen that a long time ago, before she was born, the maker of mirrors had come to them because his wife desperately wanted a child, but she was barren, and he wanted her to be happy. So the sisters made him a deal. They told him for a price that they could make it so that his wife would have a child. But the price was his soul. So when he died, they would get his soul, and he agreed. And so then when he did actually die, they took his soul and they put it in the mirror. And then they gifted the mirror to the king, knowing that he would give it to the queen. And then the queen says, well, at the funeral you mentioned something about like controlling him or taming him or something. I'm having a hard time getting him to come to the mirror when I want. So the three of them walked over to the mirror together, and in unison they say, slave in the magic mirror, come from the farthest space, in darkness and wind, we summon thee, let us see thy face. And then his face appears in the mirror. So that's how you get the mirror to show up. And before the sisters left, they told the queen that they had left another gift for her in her dungeon. But the queen was so excited about the mirror, she kind of forgot about this second gift. So that night, she went to the magic mirror and she asked him again about her husband. And the mirror told her, he's like, you know, I told you the truth before. I can't see beyond these lands and this life. So the queen decided, well, I'll ask him something else then. And, you know, she decided to ask him something that she always wondered, because she had always feared that her father was right, that she really was as ugly as he always said that she was. So she asked him, who is the fairest in the land? And he answered that she was. And then he disappeared. Now, after he told her this, she was very happy. She felt like there was a weight lifted off of her. And she now felt like she had the upper hand, that she had the power over him that he had over her for so long. And she was gonna, you know, use it. So it became a ritual for the queen. Every day she would go to the magic mirror and she would use her father's validation as a way to cure all her feelings of loss, of, you know, her fear of growing old and her fear of being the terribly ugly woman that her father always told her that she was. And this went on for years, and for years she got the same answer, that she was fairest in the land. Now over time, the queen started to become very distant from those that she once loved, including her daughter, Snow White. She couldn't seem to bring herself to spend more than a few moments with the girl. She was increasing in beauty every day, and the queen started to have these feelings for Snow White that were other than love. Now one morning, the queen gets up from bed and she goes over to open up her curtains. She looks down into the courtyard and there's Snow sitting at the well. She's feeding the birds, and the queen's looking at her, and she, you know, realized that, oh my goodness, Snow White, she's a beautiful young woman now. It's like, you know, how kids all of a sudden, they're a kid one day and then all of a sudden they're just a person. They're, you know, a young woman or a young man, and they're all grown up and beautiful. So the queen is realizing this. And then she sees, Snow doesn't notice, but the queen sees that there's a handsome young man riding on his horse on the grounds, and he stops, gets off his horse so that he can get a better look at Snow White. And the queen can tell that this young man, he seems spellbound by Snow White. She can tell that he thinks she's very beautiful, and it looks like he's like falling in love with her right then and there. Now there was something about this young man approaching Snow White that disturbed the queen. She didn't know, was it jealousy? Was she resenting Snow White for some reason? Or, which the queen just chalked it up to the fact that she was trying to protect Snow White from getting her heart broken, to protect her from love, because I mean, look, you know, how love turned out for her. That morning at breakfast, the queen tells Snow White that she thinks she needs to start taking on some responsibility, that she has no skills to speak of, and since she didn't have any suitors, they couldn't, you know, rely on the fact that she would be taken care of by a husband. So she thought that, you know, she was gonna have Snow White start helping the servants, and she got her some work clothes and thought that, you know, I guess this was the best solution for a princess to learn how to clean and cook as a way to solidify her security in the future. But Snow White was, of course, very gracious, and she was like, oh yeah, she's like, I don't mind helping out around the castle. Like, I kind of do it anyways. Now later that day, the queen was down in the dungeon and she was practicing her magic. She had finally remembered about the second gift that the cousins had left her. They had left her a bunch of spell books and potions, and she had kind of gotten into it. So she's down there practicing, and one of the servants pounds on the door, and she's just like, Your Majesty, come quick. She's like, it's urgent. Snow had fallen into the well. So the queen goes running out there and she sees Snow soaked and unconscious lying on the ground, and there's a young man bent over her body. And the queen recognizes this young man as a prince from a neighboring kingdom. Then suddenly Snow starts coming to, she starts coughing and she regains her consciousness. And the young man looked relieved. He says, he's like, thank God you're alive. And the queen goes rushing over and she grabs Snow by the arm and she tells the prince, she's like, thank you, young man, I can take it from here. And he asks, you know, can I come by tomorrow and call on her and make sure she's okay? And all the queen said was, perhaps. And then she whisked Snow off into the castle. Now, over the next 6 months, the prince called on Snow White several times. And then one day he asked to see the queen. Now, of course, this could only mean one thing. He wanted to ask for Snow's hand. But the queen was going to put a stop to this immediately. So she told the prince that Snow did not love him, that she was just being nice, trying to spare his feelings, and that was wrong. She should have been honest with him, but she didn't love him, and so she couldn't grant him her hand. And the prince was brokenhearted and he leaves. Then the queen tells Snow White that the prince had sent a note saying that he didn't love her anymore and that he was ending their courtship. And the queen, you know, justified it to herself that, you know, even though she had to lie to them, it was better that they get over their heartbreak now, quick, while they're young, instead of years from now due to betrayal or tragedy. But the queen, somewhere deep down, she knew that this was mostly motivated out of jealousy. Now, unbeknownst to the queen, Snow and the prince continued to see each other. Somehow they had figured out that this wasn't true and they kept seeing each other in secret. Now, from here on out, it's basically the movie. Now, sometime later, the queen goes to her magic mirror and she asks the same question, who's the fairest of them all? But this time, the mirror answers that it's Snow White. And the queen goes rushing to her window. She looks down into the courtyard. She sees Snow scrubbing away, and she's singing and dancing. And the queen is starting to feel kind of like some hatred for this girl. How can this girl have recovered so well from the loss of her father? How could she ever sing and dance or love again? Then the queen noticed the young prince step up next to Snow White. And Snow sees him and she jumps and she goes running off, obviously out of fear of wrath that the queen would see them together. The queen now realizes that they have figured out that she had been lying to them. But then Snow reappears at the balcony and she starts singing along with the prince, who was now sickeningly serenading her. And the queen is like, well, now this girl not only is surpassing me in her beauty, but she's found herself in love, which is, the queen thinks, an insult to her father's memory and to her. And the queen, she whirls around out of anger. And when she turns around, there are the sisters. And the queen is like, what do you want? And the sisters are like, no, 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 what do you want? And the queen is like, well, I think you know. And the sisters are like, well, you can have it if you want. We've left you all the gifts that you need. Potions, poisons, disguises that you can use to get whatever you want. They're like, after all, you come from a long line of witches. It's in your blood, just like it was in your mother's blood. Now, when she first got this news, she was shocked and she accused them of lying. Her mother was not a witch. But then she started to feel a little bit emboldened and strengthened almost. And she's thinking to herself, she's like, you know what? I do want Snow White dead. So I'm gonna get it. But she didn't want Snow White's blood on her hands. I mean, after all, what if the kingdom found out? She had to be able to blame it on somebody else. So she summons the huntsman and she tells him to take Snow White somewhere where she can pick wildflowers, and there you will kill her. And the huntsman is shocked and he protests and he's like, but she's the princess. And the queen cuts them off and she's like, you know the penalty if you fail. And the huntsman was like, yes, your majesty, because I mean, it was either Snow White or him, or worse, the lives of his family. And the queen tells him, you know, to make sure you don't fail, and for proof, bring back her heart in this. And she hands him a box. And you know, the queen had grown so cold that she didn't even realize it was the same box that contained Snow's mother's letters. Now, when the huntsman returned, he gave her the box with the heart inside. And the queen dismissed him, and she immediately went to her mirror and she asked again who was the fairest in the land. But the mirror answered Snow White again. And the queen was like, no, 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 Snow White is dead. See, the huntsman's brought me proof. And she shows the mirror the box with the heart inside. And the mirror's like, nope, you've been lied to. It's the heart of a pig that you hold in your hand. Now, furious, the queen goes storming to the stables where the huntsman is readying his horse. He's getting ready to get out of there. And she screams, she's like, you lied to me. And he's like, yeah, I thought that, you know, you might regret your choice here. And she ends up taking a dagger and stabbing him. And she pulls the dagger from him and she looks at it, and the blood shining on the dagger reminds her of a shiny red apple. So she goes to her dungeon and she creates a poisoned apple, and she disguises herself as an old peddler woman. Now she's gonna go, she knows where Snow White is. The mirror told her that she was at the cottage of the 7 dwarves and where that was. Now, with a lot of struggles, the queen in her new elderly body made her way to the cottage, and she convinced Snow White to take a bite of the apple by telling her that it was a magic wishing apple. So Snow White, she makes a wish and she takes a bite, and then she falls into a sleeping death. Now, when the queen is leaving the cottage, the 7 dwarves show up and they start chasing her, and she comes to a fork in the path. And one path leads to the forest where she could probably hide from them or lose them somehow. And then the other path leads up to a cliff. And all of a sudden, the 3 sisters materialize in front of her. And they tell her that if she chooses the path up to the cliff, she's gonna die. Then some kind of strange feeling of like guilt or something comes over the queen. Now, the forest would lead to safety most likely, and to a new life for her. But what kind of a life? And she starts to remember, you know, her wedding day, and how much her and the king had loved each other, and how much she had loved Snow White, and how Snow White had become this truly beautiful young woman, and that she actually honored her father's life by living her life to the fullest, even after his death. Unlike the queen, who had allowed, you know, pain and treachery and darkness to overcome her. So she's looking at both of these paths. She looks up to the cliff, and she knows what she needs to do because she chose her path a long time ago. Now, the dwarves buried Snow White in a above ground glass casket, and the prince had come and broken the spell. Snow White had awoken to love's first kiss. She got her wish. She got everything she wanted. So maybe that old crone's apple really was magic. And they were soon married. So it's Snow White's wedding day and she's so happy. The only thing that she longed for was to have her father and her mother's at her wedding. And no one understood why, but Snow still loved her stepmother. To Snow, she had died the same day that her father had been killed. But up until that day, she had been a guardian angel to Snow White since Snow had lost her actual mother at such a young age. Now that evening, after a long day of wedding festivities, Snow White was alone in her chambers and there were a bunch of wedding gifts stacked next to her chair. And she starts opening them, and as she's opening them, she's thinking about how much she misses her stepmother and how she wished she had been there that day. Then she goes and she opens a larger package, and it's her mother's mirror. And she was like, oh my gosh, this is the one that she used to look at obsessively. And then Snow White's taken aback because the mirror starts to fill with smoke and mist, and then a face appears, and the face says, I love you, my little bird. I always have, and I always will. And it's Snow's stepmother. And Snow White smiles, and the queen blows her a kiss. The end. Okay. What does that ending say? I'm not too sure. I'm not sure if this is saying there's going to be a continuation of this type of, I don't know, jealousy and vanity with Snow, or was it saying that the queen had kind of come to terms with everything and had kind of let go of her jealousy and her fear of growing old and all the emotional stuff with her father when she had decided to basically, you know, plunge herself off of the cliff when she chose the path of the cliff. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure which one that is alluding to. I think it's the second one. Let me know what you think. Is this saying that this is just gonna cycle on and on between the generations? Or is this, you know, is this the end of it? And the queen ended up, you know, rectifying the perpetual cycle of jealousy and vanity. What do you think? Another thing that I was pretty unclear on was the triplets' motivation behind all this, because they're the ones that kind of set this all in motion. I mean, obviously they knew that her mother had been a witch, and so they wanted her to be a witch because they were witches. Or are they just wicked and they wanted to mess with the family and with her and with Snow? Were they jealous of Snow too? Because it kind of seemed they were trying to get at Snow through the evil queen, through her stepmother. Yeah, that I totally didn't get. What was their motivation? If you've read this book and you caught it and I just didn't catch it, well, please let me know. Please let me know. So yeah, that is Fairest of all, the evil queen's backstory. And yeah, I mean, I liked it. It was entertaining. I'm definitely going to read the other books in this series. But yeah, I liked the Twisted Tale version better than this one. I don't know. What did you like better? The Twisted Tale or the Villains series version? Let me know. So yeah, that is today's video. If you liked this Halloween edition of Beauty and the Bibliophile, let me know by giving it a thumbs up. make sure and subscribe. So I've got a couple more Halloween Disney tales I'm going to be letting you in on, summarizing to you while I do my makeup during this Halloween season. So make sure and subscribe and hit the notifications bell so that you won't miss them. And I will see you in the next one. Bye. But after a while, it seemed like they dressed kind of but she said, we're getting a little bit of ahead of the king took. So her and Snow got in the boat and the queen rowed and the man, and he wanted to make her happy, but you know, couldn't somehow. Another thing I was a little unclear on was the cousins, triplets, these witchy triplets of the cousin of the king's cousin. If you liked this video, let me know by giving it a thumbs up